The entire dining room at the Ember Room went silent when Renata Ferrante set down her knife and turned around. In Chicago, everyone knew that name. She was the only daughter of Cosimo Ferrante, the woman who kept the family's books, the woman who decided whose name stayed on a payroll and whose did not. She never raised her voice. She spoke softly, and that was exactly why 60 people in that room stopped touching their silverware. That night, she pointed one finger at a 19-year-old busboy who had been on the job for 6 days and told the manager to let him go. Nobody said a word. The manager had already nodded. Then, a young woman in a black apron set down her water pitcher and stepped in front of the boy. Her name tag read Josie, 27 years old, 3 months on the job, and a hospital bill sitting on her kitchen counter that she was still $38,000 short of paying. She was the last person in that room who could afford to lose this job, and she was the only one who did not take a single step back. 30 seconds later, the most feared woman in Chicago stood up from her table without a word. But what nobody in that dining room knew, not even Josie, was that 26 years earlier, Renata Ferrante had waited tables at a roadside diner under a name that was not her own, and that an envelope had been sitting in Josie's kitchen drawer for 3 years. An envelope she had never opened. If you believe kindness still has the power to change a person, tap like and share this story with someone who needs it. Subscribe to walk the rest of Josie's journey with us, and tell us where in the world you're watching from today. At 1 o'clock in the morning, when the last bus dropped her off at the end of Windsor Street, Josie Vance could still hear the clatter of dishes in her head. She walked 3 blocks, climbed 4 flights of stairs, and opened the door as quietly as she did every night. But the living room light was still on. 9-year-old Toby was sitting cross-legged on the floor, with an open book resting upside down across his lap, and the moment he saw his sister, he sprang to his feet so quickly that the book slid onto the rug. Josie pointed at the clock, then at him, the gesture they both understood to mean that he should have been asleep 3 hours ago. Toby shrugged, grinned, then raised both hands to explain that he'd been waiting. He always waited. For 3 years, there hadn't been a single night when he'd gone to sleep before she came home. Josie set down her bag, pulled the apron over her head, and sat on the floor beside him. She took out a crumpled handful of cash, smoothed each bill flat on the wooden surface, and sorted it into 3 piles. Toby rested his chin in his hands and watched, waiting until she'd finished counting. $47. A quiet Wednesday night, few customers, thin tips. She gathered the money, tucked it into the tin box on top of the refrigerator, then turned back to him. Toby was ready. He raised his hands and made a slow sequence of signs, then looked at her expectantly. That was tonight's lesson. Josie copied him. Toby shook his head, took hold of her wrist, corrected the angle of her index finger, and pushed her elbow a little lower. She tried again. He shook his head again. On the 3rd try, he clutched his stomach and fell backward onto the rug, his shoulders shaking with laughter. The kind of laughter that made no sound and yet somehow filled the whole room with light. Josie pretended to frown, then started laughing too. On the 4th try, she got it so deliberately wrong that Toby had to cover his face with both hands. At last, he sat up and demonstrated it again, very slowly, very clearly, each movement of his fingers distinct, watching her with the stern expression of a 9-year-old teacher. Josie followed him. This time, he nodded, clapped his hands once, then spelled out the word for her. Patience. She looked at her brother's hands for a long moment. In this home, Toby was the teacher, and she was the student. He listened with his hands and spoke with his hands, and within those 4 walls, he was the loudest child alive, a child with opinions about everything, from the fact that she made her coffee too strong, to the fact that the chair on the left side of the dining table needed its screws tightened. Toby raised his hands and asked a familiar question. How much longer? Josie looked toward the calendar hanging beside the refrigerator, where 1 square had been circled in red ink. She held up 5 fingers. 5 weeks. Toby nodded with the solemn dignity of a grown man, then made the sign for putting on headphones, pointed at both of them, and tilted his head as though listening to something only he could hear. Josie understood at once. He was reminding her of the promise. This spring, the 2 of them would sit side by side and listen to a song together. The same song, at the same time, for the first time. She reached out, hooked her little finger around his, and held it there for a few seconds. Toby smiled, got to his feet, and went to his room without needing to be told, something he only did when he was satisfied with the way his evening had ended. Josie remained on the floor until the strip of light beneath his bedroom door finally disappeared. Then she stood, and the apartment became very quiet. On the kitchen table lay a white envelope from the hospital that she'd opened the week before, and hadn't found the courage to read a second time. She didn't need to read it. The number had been living inside her head for 3 months, following her through every shift, every table, every step across the dining room floor. $38,000. That was the distance between the promise she'd spoken aloud and the day circled in red on the calendar. She opened the tin box, put the $47 inside, and closed the lid. 3 years earlier, on an October afternoon, their parents had walked out of the house and never come back. Josie had been 24 when she signed the papers, making her the legal guardian of her younger brother. And she'd signed without reading them all the way through, because there are some things in life that don't require consideration. Since then, she'd worked the lunch shift at a cafe, the evening shift at the Ember Room, and slept 4 hours a day. She pulled open the bottom drawer of the kitchen cabinet. Inside, beneath old papers and bills, was an envelope yellowed at the edges, with no stamp and no recipient's address. Only her name written in the trembling handwriting of her grandmother, Ada Vance. Ada had given it to her exactly 1 week before she died, 3 years ago, and she'd said only one thing: if you run out of road, open it. Josie had held that envelope in her hands on hundreds of nights. She'd never opened it, because the day she opened it would be the day she admitted that she'd reached the end. And as long as she could still stand on her own 2 feet, she hadn't reached it yet. She put the envelope back, pushed the drawer closed, and went to take a shower. The next morning, when Josie walked into the Ember Room for her evening shift, a 19-year-old boy was standing awkwardly at the kitchen entrance with his apron tied the wrong way, and that was Milo Trask's first day on the job. Milo Trask retied the strings of his apron for the 3rd time and still got them wrong, until Josie walked past, turned him around, and tied them for him in 4 seconds. He thanked her 3 times in a row. He was 19, tall and gangly, and during the first 2 hours of his shift, he apologized more often than he actually spoke. He told her everything very quickly, as though he were afraid he wouldn't have enough time, that his mother had arthritis and this month she couldn't even hold a kettle, that he'd applied to 11 places and the Ember Room was the only one that had called him back, that he would do a good job, he promised. Josie listened, nodded, then told him to go get a tray. When it was his turn to clear table 9, he dropped a spoon. The sound of metal striking the wooden floor rang through the dining room, and guests at 3 tables looked up at once. Milo bent down to pick it up, his face burning red, and half an hour later, at table 2, he dropped another one. This time he straightened up and didn't pick it up. He only stared at his own hand, as though it were something that didn't belong to him. Josie walked over, picked up the spoon, slipped it into her apron pocket, and pulled him into the hallway behind the kitchen. She didn't say anything about the 2 spoons. She took an empty tray, placed it in his hands, and told him to watch carefully. "Don't grip the tray with your whole hand," she said. "When you hold it too tightly, you shake. 3 fingers only. Thumb on the edge, 2 fingers under the bottom, the rest relaxed. The weight rests on your elbow, not your wrist." Milo tried. The tray tilted. Josie pushed his elbow in against his side, adjusted the angle of his forearm, and told him to walk 10 steps down the hallway. He made it 6 before the tray wobbled. She made him turn around and start again. On the 4th try, he walked all 10 steps without the tray moving at all, and Milo laughed so loudly that one of the kitchen workers had to stick his head out to see what was happening. Josie told him that everyone dropped spoons during their first week, that she'd broken 2 glasses herself during her first 3 days there, and that it didn't mean anything. Milo asked how long she'd been working there. 3 months, she answered. His eyes widened, and he said he'd thought she'd been there for years. She laughed and told him that in a place like this, 3 months was long enough to know where you were standing. Near the end of the shift, when there were only 2 occupied tables left in the dining room, and Milo was polishing glasses in the corner of the kitchen, Gus Whitlow called Josie into the manager's office. He was 50 years old, had worked at the Ember Room since the days when the place had gone by a different name. And in the 3 months Josie had been there, he'd never once called her in alone. He didn't ask her to sit down. He closed the door, something else he'd never done before, then leaned against the edge of the desk and looked at her for a long while, as though weighing whether he should speak at all. In the end, he said only one thing. "If anyone from the Ferrante family walks into this dining room, don't look them directly in the eyes." Josie waited for the rest. There was no rest. That was all he said, and then he went silent. She asked why. Gus reached for the stack of invoices on the desk, flipped through a few pages, then set them down again. And in that moment, Josie realized he was looking for something to do with his hands. He told her just to remember it. She asked again, more slowly this time, whether something had happened to someone. Gus said there were some questions whose answers would only make her worse at her job, and she was the best server he'd had in 6 years, so he wanted her to keep doing what she was doing. Then he added something else, in a completely different voice, almost as though he were speaking to himself, that the boy wasn't to blame for any of it. Josie asked which boy. Gus, said Milo. She told him, of course, Milo wasn't to blame for anything. He'd only been there one day. Everyone dropped spoons. But Gus didn't laugh. He looked through the glass door of the manager's office, where Milo could be seen arranging glasses on a rack, and said he'd hired the boy without sending his paperwork upstairs the way procedure required. Josie asked where upstairs was. Gus didn't answer that. He only said that 15 years was a long time, that you couldn't make a child pay for things that had happened when he was only 4 years old, and that if anyone asked, he would take responsibility himself. Josie stood there, completely unable to understand what he was talking about. She asked what 15 years he meant. Gus pushed the invoices aside, opened the office door, and told her to go close out her shift before she missed the bus. That was the entire conversation. Later, after everything had happened and she sat remembering every detail of that week, Josie would realize that Gus Whitlow had tried to warn her twice in the same evening, and both times she had heard him without understanding. That night, she went to the bus stop, sat down on the bench, and thought about something else entirely. She thought that if business was better that week, she might be able to save another $200. 3 days later, while waiting for the kitchen to finish the order for table 6, Josie asked Dolores, the kitchen worker who had been there for 12 years, who the Ferrante family was. Dolores was chopping onions, and she didn't look up. She only asked who had mentioned that name to her. Josie said Gus had. Dolores set down the knife, wiped her hands on her apron, glanced once toward the kitchen door, then pulled Josie into the hidden corner beside the refrigerator, and from that moment on, she spoke in a voice Josie had never heard anyone use in that kitchen before. Low, even, almost without breath. The Ferrante family owns this building, Dolores said, and the building next door, and 4 more along this street. The name on the paperwork is some company, but anyone who's worked here longer than a year knows where their paycheck really comes from. Josie asked what there was to whisper about. Dolores said the problem wasn't the Ferrante family. The problem was the woman who kept the books, Renata Ferrante, the only daughter of boss Cosimo Ferrante, 39 years old, and for the past 20 years not a single dollar in that entire system had gone anywhere without passing before her eyes. She didn't manage the restaurants, didn't manage personnel, and never appeared in any meeting that had minutes. She only read the numbers, and she remembered every one of them. Dolores told her that 4 years earlier, there had been an accountant working for another family operation on the north side of the city. The man entered one number incorrectly in a quarterly report. He hadn't stolen anything. He'd simply written the wrong number. He was off by $900, and 3 weeks later he discovered it himself, corrected it himself, and reported it. Josie asked what happened. Dolores said nothing happened at all. No one shouted at him. There was no meeting. No one came looking for him. It was simply that the following month, his name was no longer on the payroll, and the month after that, no one in the accounting business in Chicago would accept his resume, and to this day, no one knew where he was, only that he no longer worked as an accountant. Dolores added that this was what frightened people, because if she shouted, at least people would know where they stood. Instead, she only spoke very softly, nodded, said thank you, then stood up and went home. In 12 years of working there, Dolores had never once heard Renata Ferrante raise her voice. Josie asked whether she came there often. Dolores said no, a few times a year, never with any warning, and every time she came, Gus had to take medicine for his stomach. Josie was about to ask more when the kitchen bell rang, and she had to carry the food out. But near the end of the shift, when the whole kitchen sat down to divide the tips, the conversation returned to the same subject. This time, because the young bartender brought it up. He said things had been changing lately, that the year before, every employee across the entire operation had finally been given a formal contract with insurance, something that had never happened before, and that it was because of the younger brother. Josie asked which younger brother. Nico Ferrante, he answered, 34 years old, head of the family for 6 years now, ever since the old man died, and Nico was doing something no one in that bloodline had ever done before. He was pulling the entire family into the light, slowly selling off the things that couldn't be explained, buying restaurants, logistics companies, real estate, anything with an invoice, anything that could be taxed. People said he wanted the day to come when the Ferrante name would be nothing more than a family name printed on a company sign, no more than that. Dolores gave a dismissive grunt and said that was easier said than done. The bartender asked why it was so difficult. Dolores said because there was one person in that family who didn't agree, and that person was his older sister. She said Nico Ferrante could give orders to every man in the family, but there was exactly one person he couldn't command, and that was the woman who had raised him since he was a little boy. The entire kitchen went quiet for a moment. Then someone changed the subject to baseball. The tips were divided, and everyone pulled on their coats and headed home. Josie walked to the bus stop, sat down, and thought over everything she'd just heard. She remembered 3 things. Don't look them directly in the eyes. She never raises her voice. And Gus has to take stomach medicine every time she comes. Then Josie folded all 3 things away and stored them in the back of her mind, the way a person might save a scrap of weather news about a city they would never visit. Because in Josie Vance's mind at that moment, the Ferrante family's affairs belonged to the people sitting on the other side of the dining room, while her own life was inside the tin box on top of the refrigerator, and inside a square circled in red on the calendar. The bus arrived. She got on. 4.5 weeks left. On Friday night, the Ember Room was fully booked from 7 o'clock onward. Josie was assigned the east side of the dining room, 6 tables, with Milo helping clear all of them. He hadn't dropped a single thing in 4 straight days, and had started carrying trays with 3 fingers without even thinking about it anymore. The first guest arrived earlier than everyone else, a man seated at table 11, the table tucked against the stone column in the corner, the one regular customers usually avoided because it left them with their backs to the room and no view of anyone around them. He asked for that exact table. Josie handed him a menu, but he returned it immediately and ordered without opening it, a fish dish and water, no wine. He sat with his back straight, didn't use his phone, didn't read anything, only ate slowly while looking at the stone wall in front of him. Milo passed by and quietly asked Josie whether it was sad for someone to eat dinner alone on a Friday night. Josie told him plenty of people liked eating alone, and she didn't give it another thought. At 8:15, the front door opened, and Josie knew something had happened before she even had time to turn her head, because the conversation on the west side of the dining room suddenly dropped a level. A platinum-haired woman with her hair pulled tightly into a bun walked in with 2 men in dark suits, carrying leather briefcases. She didn't hand her coat to anyone. She didn't stop at the host stand. She walked straight toward table 4, as though that table had always belonged to her, and the 2 men followed half a step behind. Josie saw Gus Whitlow come out of the kitchen, stop halfway across the room, then turn around and go back inside. 30 seconds later, he came out again wearing the expression of a man who had just swallowed something. He approached table 4, bent slightly at the waist, and said a few words. The woman didn't look at him. She only gave the smallest nod. Gus stepped back and walked directly to Josie. He told her to take table 4. Josie asked why it couldn't be someone else. Gus said because she made fewer mistakes than anyone else in the room. Then he added that she remembered what he'd told her the other day. Josie understood immediately who the woman was. She picked up the water pitcher, checked once more that her collar was straight, and walked toward table 4. The 2 lawyers had already opened their briefcases and spread papers across one corner of the table, and they stopped talking when she approached. Josie greeted the table, poured water for all 3 of them, beginning from the right as procedure required, and didn't look directly into anyone's eyes. She listened as the 2 men ordered very quickly, as though ordering dinner were simply a formality they needed to get through. Then it was the woman's turn. She ordered a single dish, no appetizer, no wine, and she spoke so softly that Josie had to lean half a step closer to hear her clearly. There was nothing harsh in that voice. It was simply the voice of someone who never had to speak loudly, because for 20 years, no one had ever made her repeat herself a second time. Josie repeated the order back to make sure she had it right, and at the exact moment she looked up to confirm it, she caught Renata Ferrante's gaze. The woman wasn't looking at Josie's face. She was looking at the name tag pinned to the left side of her apron. Her eyes remained there for more than a second. Then they moved from left to right over it once again, slowly and distinctly, like someone rereading a line because they thought they must have read it wrong the first time. Her hand, resting against the rim of her glass, didn't move. Josie stood there for one more beat, then asked whether she needed anything else. Renata Ferrante lifted her eyes, looked directly into Josie's for a single moment, and said no, thank you. Josie nodded, turned, and walked into the kitchen. She didn't think anything of it. During a Friday night shift, a good server didn't have time to think about things like that, and she still had 5 other tables waiting, a wine order that had been mixed up at table 9, and Milo struggling with a tray of dishes that was far too full near the kitchen entrance. Later, after everything was over, and people asked her which moment had been the moment when it all began, Josie Vance would always answer that it wasn't when she stepped forward and stood between Milo Trask and someone else. Everything had started 17 minutes earlier, at table 4, when a woman read her name twice and said nothing. But at the time, Josie simply pushed open the kitchen door, handed the order to the chef, and told Milo to put that tray down, not to try carrying everything at once, and that nobody was going to die if he made 2 trips. Milo smiled, set the tray down, and walked back into the dining room carrying half the dishes. That was the last time Josie saw him smile that night. Milo Trask was counting his steps. It was a trick he'd come up with on his second day at work, because if he counted, he didn't think about the fact that his hands were shaking. 3 fingers, elbow tucked close to his side, weight carried through the arm instead of the wrist, and count. 1, 2, 3. The tray was heavier this time than he'd expected, because he'd picked up 2 extra plates from table 6 to save himself another trip. 4, 5. His left wrist was starting to burn at the joint, the same place that always began to ache whenever he carried things for more than 10 minutes. He thought about his mother, about how she'd needed him to open the cap on her medicine bottle that morning, and he thought that if he could make it through this month, then next month he'd ask for extra lunch shifts. 6, 7. The aisle between the tables on the west side was narrower than the one on the east, barely wide enough for 1 person and a tray, and on Friday nights every chair had been pulled a few inches farther back than where it had started. 8, 9. He leaned to avoid a chair on his left, and at that exact moment his right elbow brushed the back of the chair on his right, very lightly, so lightly that the tray in his hands didn't tilt at all. Not 1 plate shifted, not 1 drop of water spilled from the glass on the table. Nothing fell, nothing broke, no one got wet. The person sitting in the chair didn't even move. Milo stopped, turned halfway around, and said, "I'm sorry, ma'am." He said it by reflex, the same way he'd said it 40 times over the past 6 days, and he meant to keep walking. Then he heard a very small sound, the sound of a knife being placed against the edge of a porcelain plate. In a dining room where 60 people were talking, no one should have been able to hear that sound. Milo heard it, and he understood at once, in the same instinctive way a small animal understands that something has just risen behind it, that he shouldn't keep walking. The woman at table 4 turned all the way around. The 2 lawyers stopped eating. She looked at him from bottom to top, and the first thing Milo noticed was that she wasn't angry at all. Her face was perfectly calm. Then she spoke, and she didn't call him boy, didn't call him busboy, didn't say a single word about the chair or the tray. She called him by his last name, Trask. She said the name slowly, separating it into 2 syllables, like someone checking whether she'd remembered it correctly. Milo stood frozen with the tray still in his hands. In 6 days of working there, he'd never told his last name to anyone except Gus, and his name tag said only Milo. Then she asked him a question. She asked whether he knew what his father had done 15 years ago. Milo opened his mouth, and nothing came out. He'd been 4 years old that year. He couldn't even remember his father's face, only a photograph tucked inside a drawer at home and the fact that his mother never answered when he asked about him. He said he didn't understand, ma'am. The woman gave one very small nod, as though that was exactly the answer she'd been expecting. She said that of course he didn't understand, because there were some things people deliberately chose not to tell their children, and in his case, she thought his mother had made the right choice. Then she said that none of that changed anything anyway. In the dining room, the 3 nearest tables had gone completely silent. The tray in Milo's hands began to feel heavy in a different way. 10 feet away, Gus Whitlow stood frozen at the entrance to the kitchen. He hadn't heard the entire question. He'd heard only 1 word, the 1 word he'd spent the past 6 days hoping no one in that building would ever say aloud. Trask. And in the next 3 seconds, Gus Whitlow understood everything at once. He understood that she knew. He understood that she'd known before she'd even walked into the restaurant that night. He understood that the boy's paperwork had never been sent upstairs according to procedure because he'd been the one who had skipped that step, because he'd convinced himself that 15 years was long enough, that no one remembered anymore, that a 4-year-old child couldn't possibly be guilty of anything. He understood that he'd been wrong, and he understood that there was exactly 1 person in that building who read every payroll sheet from every operation, and that person was sitting 10 feet away from him. The woman turned and looked for him across the dining room. She found him immediately because he'd already been standing there watching. She began to speak, her voice still as soft as before, saying that she thought it would be best if tonight this young man should. Gus Whitlow nodded before she finished the sentence. He nodded once, then nodded again, and he didn't dare look toward Milo. And Milo Trask, 19 years old, 6 days on the job, still standing in the middle of the aisle with a tray of dishes in his hands, understood that he'd just lost his job and still had no idea why. "He didn't spill anything, ma'am." The words came from behind Milo, clear and calm, in a dining room where, only seconds earlier, no one had dared to breathe too loudly. Josie Vance was pouring water for table 7 when she heard the name Trask spoken in the middle of the room, and she'd set the water pitcher down on the table before she'd even finished forming a complete thought. 11 steps. She would count them later, lying in bed at 4 o'clock in the morning and reconstructing every moment of that night. 11 steps from table 7 to where Milo was standing. Long enough for her to think of 20 different things, and somehow think of none of them at all. She came around on his right side, lifted the tray out of his hands, and set it on the service table, because he'd been holding it for nearly 2 minutes, and his wrist was shaking so badly that one wrong step would send everything on it crashing to the floor, and then there would be no saving him. Then she stepped into the space between them, between the chair at table 4 and the 19-year-old boy whose last name had just been spoken aloud. She continued, still using the same ordinary voice she used when reading the menu to guests, saying that his elbow had touched the back of the chair. That much was true. She had been standing about 13 feet away, and she'd seen it herself. But nothing had spilled, nothing had broken, no one had gotten wet, and there was no damage for the woman to concern herself with. She said the west aisle was narrower than standard, that on Friday nights the chairs were pulled farther back than usual, and that this was a problem with the section, not with the person carrying the tray. Then she said the final sentence, and she said it more slowly than the 3 before it. "He's in his first week, and he's working under my guidance. If anyone has to take responsibility for that aisle tonight, it's me." For the next 2 seconds, nothing happened at all. Then Renata Ferrante turned fully around. That was the detail the people seated near table 4 would still be talking about months later, because until that moment she'd only turned half a shoulder to look at the busboy, the posture of someone still in the middle of dinner, who had paused only because of a minor inconvenience. Now she pushed her chair back slightly, turned her whole body, and lifted her face to look directly at Josie. The 2 lawyers stopped eating. One of them quietly set down his fork without making a sound. At the kitchen entrance, Gus Whitlow raised one hand to his mouth, then lowered it again. Dolores stepped 2 paces out of the kitchen and stopped. And at table 11 in the corner, the man dining alone still sat with his back to the room, but he'd stopped chewing. Josie didn't realize that she'd just done something no employee anywhere in the Ferrante family's entire operation had done in 20 years. It wasn't talking back. People had done that before, once or twice, and the stories were still told. What Josie had done was entirely different. She had spoken without being asked. In the world Renata Ferrante had inhabited for 20 years, a world where every conversation began from her side and ended when she decided it was over. A server stepping into the middle of it and speaking on her own wasn't insolence. It was something that didn't exist within the system. It was like a number appearing on a balance sheet, with no explanation of where it had come from. Renata looked at her. She looked at the name tag first, for the 3rd time that night, and only then lifted her eyes to Josie's face. She looked for a long time, longer than politeness allowed, long enough that Milo behind Josie began breathing too quickly, and Gus had to grip the edge of the kitchen doorway. Josie stayed where she was. She didn't look down at the floor. She didn't step back, and she didn't stare directly into the woman's eyes in a way that challenged her. She simply stood there, her arms resting at her sides, between a seated woman and a standing boy, exactly where she'd chosen to place herself. Then Renata Ferrante spoke. She didn't raise her voice. She never raised her voice. She asked only one question, and she asked it so softly that the person at table 5 had to tilt their head to hear, and that was precisely why the entire dining room heard it. "Do you know who you're talking to?" "I know, ma'am," Josie answered immediately, without hesitation, and she spoke in the tone of someone confirming an obvious fact, rather than challenging anyone. She said she knew the woman was Renata Ferrante. She said that 3 days earlier, someone in the kitchen had told her who she was, and she'd listened very carefully. Then she continued, and this was where her voice changed. Not louder, only slower. She said that knowing a person's name didn't make humiliating someone in front of a room full of people acceptable. Somewhere in the dining room, someone drew in a breath. Renata Ferrante didn't blink. She sat perfectly still for 2 beats, both hands resting neatly in her lap, then said that she hadn't humiliated anyone. She'd only asked a question about the boy's family. Josie answered that she'd asked it in front of 60 people, and she knew perfectly well he couldn't answer it. She'd asked it softly, so the entire room would have to fall silent and listen. Josie said that wasn't a question. It was a punishment spoken in the form of a question. One of the 2 lawyers quietly pushed his chair back a few inches, the unconscious movement of a man trying to move beyond the reach of whatever was about to happen. Renata turned her head and looked at him for a single moment, and he became still again. Then she turned back to Josie. She said that in 20 years she'd never had to explain one of her questions to anyone, and she wasn't going to start on a Friday night in a dining room. She said Josie would apologize, not for defending the boy, but for inserting herself into a conversation she hadn't been invited into. Then she added that Josie had 3 seconds. She didn't count aloud. She didn't need to. The entire dining room counted for her. Later, when the video had been watched and replayed by millions of people and viewers froze the frame at that exact moment to guess what the girl in the black apron was thinking, there would be countless theories. People would say she was thinking about the bills. People would say she was thinking about her younger brother. People would say she was calculating what she stood to lose and what she stood to gain. None of that would be true. In those 3 seconds, Josie Vance didn't think about a single number. She didn't see the calendar hanging on the wall of her kitchen at home. She didn't hear the sound of the tin box on top of the refrigerator. 3 seconds is too short for a person to think about their future. 3 seconds is only long enough to see what is right in front of them. And what was right in front of Josie then was Milo Trask's hand. He'd picked the tray back up from the service table by reflex, because for the past 6 days, he'd been taught that dirty trays had to be carried into the kitchen, and he didn't know what else to do with his hands. He held it against his chest, and his fingers were trembling against the rim of the metal tray. Trembling so badly that Josie could see the rim shaking with them, the 3 fingers she'd taught him to place in exactly the right position, still trying to hold on to something he no longer needed to hold. He wasn't crying. He was only standing there staring at the floor, 19 years old, 6 days on the job, having just been asked a question about a man whose face he couldn't even remember, his hands shaking because he didn't understand what was happening to his life. Josie had seen those hands somewhere else before. She'd seen them 3 nights earlier, when he dropped the second spoon and stood staring at his own hand, as though it belonged to someone else. And she'd seen them somewhere else too, at home, in an apartment on Windsor Street, on the living room floor, another pair of hands much smaller than his, patiently correcting the position of her fingers and laughing because she'd gotten it wrong for the 4th time. Some hands can say more than a person's mouth ever could. 3 seconds passed. Josie didn't count them. She lifted her eyes to Renata Ferrante, and in that moment she understood very clearly what was about to happen to her job, to the red circled square on the calendar, to the promise of a song in the spring. She understood all of it, and she opened her mouth anyway. "I'm sorry, ma'am." Josie said that first, and for the brief half-second that followed, the entire dining room thought it was over. Gus Whitlow released his grip on the edge of the kitchen doorway. One of the 2 lawyers lifted his fork. Then Josie continued. She said she was sorry that the woman's dinner had been disturbed, because on a Friday night, in a restaurant, guests came there to eat, not to witness something like this, and for that part, the fault was hers. But she wouldn't apologize for stepping forward and standing where she was standing. She said she wouldn't apologize for placing herself in front of someone who had just been treated as though his dignity were worth less than a chair someone had brushed against. Renata Ferrante said nothing. She only leaned back slightly, and Josie continued, no faster, no louder, her voice still as steady as when she read a menu. But now everyone at all 4 rows of tables around them had turned fully to watch. She said there was something the people who sat down to eat there never thought about, and she didn't blame them, because she'd once been the person sitting at the table before she became the person standing beside it. Servers weren't invisible. They only looked that way because they were trained to look that way. They were taught to approach from the right, to pour water without making a sound, to disappear when guests were having a private conversation, and never to let anyone remember their faces. But beneath that apron was a human being with a life waiting at home. She said the boy standing behind her had a mother who hadn't been able to open the cap on her medicine bottle by herself that morning. She said the kitchen worker standing in that doorway had worked there for 12 years and was raising 3 grandchildren. She said she didn't know every person's story in that room, but she knew one thing for certain, that every one of them was carrying some kind of debt, some piece of paper lying on a kitchen table, some date circled on a calendar that they didn't want to think about. And there were nights when people walked into a shift with only enough strength left inside them to keep their backs straight for 8 hours. Just enough, not a little bit more. She said that on a night like that, one quiet sentence from someone sitting down to dinner could take away that final piece. Then Josie stopped. She looked down at her own hands, then looked up again. She said she'd heard the stories people told about Renata. She said they didn't tell them in ordinary voices. They pulled one another into corners of the kitchen and lowered their voices, and they glanced toward the door before they began. She said she'd heard the story about an accountant who entered $900 incorrectly, discovered the mistake himself, reported it himself, and afterward disappeared from every payroll in the city, and to this day no one knew where he was. She said people didn't tell one another that story because they hated her. They told it because they were afraid. And she said she understood, because tonight she was afraid too. She was afraid right now. And if Renata looked closely, she would see that Josie's hands weren't completely still either. She said fear was very effective. It made a manager nod before she had even finished her sentence. It made 60 people in that room afraid to touch their knives and forks. It made people do everything she wanted. Faster, cleaner, and without asking a single question. Then Josie Vance said the last thing. She said it very slowly. And she said it to a woman whom, in 20 years, no one in the family, no one in the entire organization, not even the younger brother she'd raised since he was a young boy, had ever dared to say it aloud to. Fear can make people obey you, but it will never make them respect you. No one in the dining room moved. Renata Ferrante opened her mouth. Her lips parted, her chin lowered slightly, and the person sitting at table 5 would later say that she drew a breath, unmistakably drew a breath, the movement of someone about to speak, but nothing came out. She remained like that for about 3 heartbeats, and through all 3 of them Josie stayed exactly where she was, neither stepping back nor adding another word. Then Renata closed her mouth. She reached for the napkin in her lap, folded it in half, folded it once more, and placed it on the edge of the table beside the plate that was still almost untouched. She did it very slowly and very carefully, as though it were the most important thing in the room at that moment. The 2 lawyers looked at each other, then rose together, and one of them began gathering the papers into his leather briefcase with the hurried movements of a man who wanted to leave as quickly as possible. Renata Ferrante stood. She didn't look at Josie. She didn't look at Milo. She didn't look at Gus. She walked straight toward the front door, her steps even, no faster than when she'd entered, and the 2 men followed half a step behind her. The door closed. No one in the dining room said anything for nearly 10 seconds. Then, in the corner beside the stone column, the man dining alone at table 11 set down his knife and fork, turned his chair, and stood. Gus Whitlow had just lifted a tray of empty glasses from the service table, and he nearly dropped the entire thing. He stood rooted to the floor, both hands gripping the rim of the tray, his eyes fixed on the man walking from the corner into the middle of the aisle. 6 years earlier, Gus had seen that face exactly once, during a company-wide meeting on the 40th floor from more than 60 feet away. He'd never thought he would remember it. But there are some faces a person only needs to see once. Nico Ferrante walked over to Milo Trask, and the 19-year-old boy was still holding the tray of dishes against his chest, not knowing where to put it. Nico said exactly 3 things to him. He said his job was still his. He said no one in that building had the right to question him about what his father had done, including the person who'd just done it. Then he told him to go wash his face and come back out to finish his shift. Milo nodded, and he still didn't understand who this man was until Gus, standing behind them, made a sound that was almost a gasp. Nico turned to Gus. He said Gus would receive a phone call the next morning, and that he should answer every question honestly and not invent anything. Gus opened his mouth to explain about the paperwork, about how he'd skipped the step of sending it upstairs, but Nico had already turned away. He paused for 1 beat as he passed Josie. He looked at her, neither too long nor too briefly, the look of someone filing something away for later use. He didn't say a word to her. Then he walked out, leaving cash on table 11 as he always did, and left. Josie finished the rest of her shift. She served the remaining 5 tables, closed out at 11:40, counted her tips, and she made more in tips than she had on any night in the previous 3 months, because 4 different tables left twice their usual amount, and one of them tucked in a small note that she didn't read. On the bus ride home, her hands began to shake, and she let them shake. The next morning, her phone rang at 9:15. Gus told her to come to the restaurant and said she didn't need to wear her uniform. Josie arrived at 11 o'clock. The dining room was empty. The chairs still turned upside down on the tables, and Gus Whitlow sat behind the desk in the manager's office with a sheet of paper lying in front of him. He didn't ask her to sit, exactly as he hadn't the last time, but this time it was for an entirely different reason. He picked up the paper with both hands and read it aloud to her, line by line, because that was procedure, and because he didn't trust his hands to remain steady enough to simply hand it over. It was a notice terminating her employment, issued by the Corporate Human Resources Department, effective immediately, citing a violation of the rules governing conduct toward customers. At the bottom of the page, beneath the approval line, was a very small, very neat handwritten signature. Renata Ferrante. Josie asked why Milo was allowed to stay and she wasn't. Gus said he didn't know, and it was the most truthful answer he'd ever given her. He apologized to her 3 times. The first time when he finished reading, the second when he handed her the envelope containing the wages for her remaining 4 days of work, the third when she had already reached the door. And through all 10 of those minutes, Gus Whitlow never once dared to lift his eyes and look at her face. Josie got home close to noon and sat down on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet door, the envelope containing 4 days of wages still untouched in her coat pocket. Toby was at school. The apartment was so quiet she could hear the refrigerator running. She sat there for a long time, and the strange thing was that she wasn't thinking about the fact that she'd just lost a job. She'd lost jobs before. She knew what that felt like. It was like missing a step on a staircase. Unpleasant, jarring, but something you could recover from and stand up again. What kept her from getting up that morning was something else entirely. That afternoon, Toby would come home, throw his backpack onto the chair, run into the kitchen for water, and make the familiar gesture, pointing at the calendar and then raising his hands to ask how much longer. He asked that question almost every day. And that afternoon, for the first time in 3 years, Josie Vance didn't know what she would tell him. She wasn't afraid of losing a job. She was afraid of having to tell a 9-year-old boy that the promise of a song in the spring would have to wait longer, without being able to tell him how much longer. She was sitting there trying to calculate how many extra shifts she might be able to find in 4 weeks when the phone in her pocket vibrated. Then it vibrated again. Then it wouldn't stop vibrating. She pulled it out and saw 17 messages from numbers she hadn't saved, 3 missed calls, and 1 message from Dolores containing nothing but a link and 2 words. "Watch this." Josie tapped it. It was a vertical video, slightly shaky at the beginning, becoming clearer around the 5th second. The angle was from table 9, tilted slightly to the left, looking directly into the west aisle. Someone among the 60 people who'd been having dinner that night had quietly raised a phone from the moment the knife was placed against the edge of the plate, and that person had recorded everything, all of it, from the moment the name Trask was spoken aloud to the moment the front door closed behind the 3 people dressed in dark clothing. Josie watched it once, closed it, then opened it again and watched it a second time, and only on the second viewing did she realize that the voice in the video didn't sound like her own. It sounded much calmer than she'd felt inside at the time. In the lower corner of the screen was a number, and the number changed every time she refreshed the page. At noon that day, it was 200,000. By the afternoon, when Toby came home, it had passed 1 million. By late that night, when she sat on the living room floor and said nothing to him about what had happened, the number had climbed beyond 4 million. Chicago recognized her before she had even begun to understand what was happening. The next morning, she went to the grocery store at the end of the street, and the woman at the register looked at her for 2 seconds before asking if she was the girl from the video. On the bus, an elderly man sitting across from her nodded in greeting as though she were someone he knew. At the station, 2 young women asked to take a picture with her. Some people messaged her to say they'd cried while watching, that their mother had worked as a restaurant server for 30 years, and no one had ever once spoken up for her. Some people called Josie a hero, and the word made her uncomfortable, because a hero didn't sit on a kitchen floor worrying about the next 4 weeks. But there were other messages too. Someone wrote that she had no idea who she'd just crossed. Someone else wrote that in this city, videos like that usually had a second part, and the second part was never pleasant. One message contained only a single sentence, sent at 2 o'clock in the morning, saying that she would regret those 30 seconds for the rest of her life. Josie read them all, answered none of them, then switched off her phone and put it in the drawer, the same drawer that held the yellowed envelope from her grandmother. She thought the whole thing would cool down in a few days, the way everything online eventually did, and that she needed to focus on finding another job. She was wrong, because that same evening, in an office 4 miles south of Windsor Street, inside a building with no sign, a man was watching the video for the 4th time on a large screen. He wasn't watching the part where Josie spoke. He kept rewinding the final 30 seconds, the part where Renata Ferrante folded her napkin in half, and then stood and walked out without managing to say a single word. He froze the frame on her face. Then he opened a notebook, and in the steady handwriting of a man who had kept careful records for 20 years, he wrote down 3 words: Josie Vance. He underlined the name twice. On Tuesday morning, someone rang the bell at the apartment on Windsor Street. It was a middle-aged man in a gray coat, standing 2 steps back from the door, and he didn't try to come inside. He said Mr. Ferrante wanted to see her, that a car was waiting downstairs, and that she was free to refuse and nothing would happen if she did. Josie asked which Mr. Ferrante. The man replied that there was only one person people called that. She asked the neighbor downstairs to pick Toby up that afternoon, then put on her coat. The building was downtown, and the elevator went straight to the 40th floor, without stopping once. Nico Ferrante's office looked nothing like what she'd imagined on the way there. Nothing about it suggested the things people whispered about that family name. There was only a large desk covered with files, several bookshelves against the walls, and a window overlooking the gray lake. He stood when she entered, indicated a chair for her, and poured her a glass of water without asking whether she wanted one. Then he thanked her. Josie asked what he was thanking her for. He said for Friday night. She answered that she'd just lost her job because of Friday night, so she wasn't sure it was something worth thanking her for. Nico said he knew about that, and he would talk about it, but not yet. He sat down, pushed a stack of files aside, and said there were some things she needed to hear from him, because no one else would tell her, and because she'd said something that night that he'd been thinking about for 4 days. Then he began. He said his sister hadn't always been the woman Josie had met. When Renata was 13, something happened at their home. Their father's enemies found their way all the way to the door. Nico said it exactly that way, all the way to the door, and he gave no further details, nor did he need to. The very next week, their father sent Renata away, not to relatives, not to another city, but completely away, beyond everything connected to the Ferrante name. A 13-year-old girl left home carrying a name that wasn't her own, and no one in the family was allowed to know where she was, not even the people closest to their father, because the only way to keep a secret was for no one to know it. Renata disappeared for 2 years. Josie asked how she'd lived during those 2 years. Nico was silent for a long time. Then he said that was exactly what he couldn't answer. He said that in all 34 years of his life, he'd never known where his sister had been, how she'd survived, or who she'd met during those 2 years. His father never spoke of it. The others didn't know. And Renata had never, not once, mentioned those 2 years in front of anyone. It wasn't that she refused to answer. She simply never allowed the question to exist. He told Josie that when he was a child, he'd asked once, and Renata had only looked at him and told him to go do his homework, and he'd never asked again. The only thing he knew was that his sister came home at 15, and the person who came back wasn't the girl who'd left. Nico said he was only 10 years old at the time and too young to understand what had happened. But the older people in the family said the girl came home and didn't cry, didn't embrace anyone, didn't tell them anything, only asked for paper and a pen so she could begin studying again. 3 years later, at 18, she had taken control of the family's entire accounting system, and since then not a single dollar had moved through it without passing before her eyes. Josie asked about their parents. Nico said his mother passed away shortly after Renata returned home, and his father was always somewhere that wasn't home. The person who taught him mathematics was Renata. The person who signed his school papers was Renata. The person sitting in the last row at his graduation was Renata. And she had chosen the chair beside the door, the one from which she could see every entrance and every exit. He said it had taken him many years to understand why she always chose seats like that. Then Nico said something Josie would remember for the rest of her life. He said that at 13, his sister had put on a suit of armor in order to survive, and no one blamed her for that. The problem was that no one had ever told her when it became safe to take it off. She'd worn it for 26 years, and at some point, the armor stopped being something she wore. It became the only face she still knew how to put on. Nico Ferrante opened a drawer in his desk, took out a sheet of paper, wrote on it with the pen that had been lying on the desktop, then pushed it across to Josie. He didn't say anything while he did it, and he didn't say anything after he was finished. Josie looked down. It was a check. The amount written on it wasn't one of those round numbers people chose when they wanted to look generous. It was an uneven number, exact down to the dollar, and she recognized it immediately as the precise amount printed on the hospital paper lying on her kitchen table at home, $38,000 and a little more. Not $1 short, not $1 extra. She looked up. Nico said he'd had someone look into her situation, and he said it plainly, without apologizing and without trying to soften it. He said that when a video had 4 million views, and one of the people in it belonged to his organization, finding out who she was had taken no more than an afternoon. He said the money wasn't meant to buy her silence. There were no conditions attached, and she didn't have to sign anything. Then he said she'd lost her job for defending one of his employees, and he believed that should be corrected. Josie looked at the check for a long time. Later, she wouldn't remember how long. Maybe 10 seconds. Maybe a full minute. She thought about the square circled in red. She thought about the tin box on top of the refrigerator with $47 inside. She thought about Toby's hand pointing at the calendar and then lifting to ask how much longer. She thought that all she had to do was pick up that piece of paper and slip it into her coat pocket. And every night she'd spent sitting on the kitchen floor would end today. Then she placed 2 fingers against the edge of the check and pushed it back toward him. Nico didn't move. Josie said thank you, and she meant it. Then she said that on Friday night, she'd stood in the middle of a dining room and said certain things in front of 60 people. She said those words hadn't had a price then, they had simply been true. But if she carried that check out of the building now, then beginning tomorrow those words would have a price, and that price would be $38,000. She said she didn't care what strangers thought. She'd read enough messages from people she didn't know over the past 3 days to understand that people would believe whatever they wanted to believe. But there was one person whose opinion mattered to her. She said Milo Trask was 19 years old, and he was going to carry what happened that night for a very long time. If she took the money, then for the rest of his life, he would be the boy who'd been saved by someone who later sold herself, and he would never be completely certain that anyone had ever stood up for him without wanting something in return. She said she wouldn't take that away from him. Nico sat in silence. Then Josie continued, and this time her voice changed slightly, softer but no less firm. She said she'd listened to everything he'd told her about his sister, and she believed every word. She said she understood why a 13-year-old girl, taken away from her own home under a name that wasn't hers, might return 2 years later, no longer knowing how to cry. She said she didn't think Renata was a bad person. Then she said pain could explain many things. It could explain why someone became the way they were, why they chose the chair that gave them a view of every exit, why they never allowed anyone to come too close. But it couldn't erase the pain they caused other people. She said the 19-year-old boy standing there clutching a tray that night didn't owe his sister an explanation, and he wasn't obligated to understand her either. A person could be someone worth pitying and someone who caused harm at the same time, and both things could be true at once. Nico Ferrante looked at her for a long while, then folded the check in half and put it back into the drawer. He didn't argue with a single word. In the 6 years he'd sat in that office, many people had occupied the exact chair Josie was sitting in. Some had begged, some had bargained, some had accepted what he offered and thanked him 3 times. No one had ever pushed that piece of paper back toward him. He stood and walked her to the door, and before she stepped into the elevator, he said only one thing to her, that he hoped she wouldn't come to regret this decision. Josie answered that she hoped so too. 3 days later, she would receive a second offer, and this time, the person making it wasn't on the Ferrante family's side. That same afternoon, on the 40th floor, Nico Ferrante placed a thin file on the desk in front of his sister and told her to read it. It was a copy. The original was in the hands of the Halloran family, and they'd sent someone to deliver this copy to his office that morning, with no letter and no message attached, because in their world, sending a file was the entire message. Renata opened it, read the first page, then the second, and she didn't turn another page. She already knew what was inside. Nico said the documents were 20 years old, that most of the figures in them were beyond the statute of limitations, and that if they ever reached a courtroom, the entire family would face a few administrative penalties and nothing more. He said the family as a whole would be fine. Then he told her the rest. He said there were 3 pages in that file, bearing only one signature, and that signature wasn't their father's, wasn't anyone else's in the family. It was hers. He said the Hallorans didn't care about the Ferrante family. They cared about one person. Renata closed the file and pushed it aside. She asked what he intended to do. Nico said he was going to sign. He would sign the agreement transferring 3 parcels of land on the south side to the Hallorans, exactly as they wanted, and he would do it openly, through lawyers, with contracts, notarization, and taxes paid. He said it was the only way to end this without anyone losing anything more. Renata said their father would never have signed it. Nico answered that their father had been dead for 6 years. She said she knew 3 ways to make sure that file never left the Halloran building, and none of those ways required anyone's signature. Nico said no. She said he didn't understand how people would read this, that if the Ferrante family sat down and signed papers because they'd been threatened, then within a year there would be 4 other groups knocking at the door. Nico said he'd already accounted for that. She asked how. He said he was planning for the day when there would be nothing left to threaten. That conversation lasted 40 minutes, and not once during those 40 minutes did either of them raise their voice. The secretary sitting outside the office would later say she couldn't make out a single sentence. Didn't hear a chair scrape. Didn't hear papers thrown onto a desk. There were only 2 steady voices drifting through the wooden door, both of them quiet, and that was precisely why she didn't dare leave her desk for the entire 40 minutes. Then the door opened. Renata Ferrante walked out, put on her coat, and went straight to the elevator. She didn't slam the door. She only closed it behind her, gently and decisively, and the sound of that door closing was the loudest sound in the entire conversation. 2 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, Josie Vance was standing at the bus stop on Windsor Street after interviewing at a diner on the north side and not getting the job. A black car pulled up to the curb. The man who stepped out had silver hair and wore a long coat, and he called her by name. He said he didn't represent the Ferrante family, and he said that first, as though it were the most important thing. He said he'd watched the video all 4 times, and that many people in the city had watched it too. Then he made her an offer, a sum of money, and he named the amount, and it was larger than the amount on the check she'd pushed back across a desk 3 days earlier. In return, she would sit in front of a camera, or in front of a panel, or both, and she would describe exactly what had happened on Friday night at the Ember Room. She would say she'd been fired for defending an employee. She would say how the Ferrante family treated the people who worked for them. He said she wouldn't have to invent a single word. She only had to tell the truth, and the truth was already in her hands. Josie stood there for a long time. She thought about the termination notice with the small, neat signature at the bottom. She thought about 11 o'clock that morning, about the 3 times Gus had apologized without daring to lift his eyes to her face. Everything this man wanted her to say was true. Not one word would be a lie. Then she asked him one question. She asked what would happen to that woman if she did it. The silver-haired man said that wasn't something she needed to concern herself with. Josie said she wouldn't do it. Thank you. He asked again, slowly this time, repeating the amount. She said no a second time. The black car drove away. Josie didn't get on the bus. She walked 2 miles home through the April afternoon, and for the entire distance, she tried to understand why she'd just refused. By the time she turned onto Windsor Street, she understood, and what she understood made her stop in the middle of the sidewalk. She had just protected the very person who had destroyed her life. At 9 o'clock on Saturday night, Gus Whitlow called Josie, and his voice sounded like that of a man who had just finished running. He said someone wanted to meet her at the restaurant after closing, and he added that he'd tried to explain that she no longer worked there, but it hadn't changed anything. Josie asked who. Gus was silent for exactly 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds, she already knew the answer. She arrived at 11:30. The Ember Room had turned off all the dining room lights except the row of wall lamps on the west side and a single desk lamp someone had carried out from the manager's office and placed on table 4. The chairs had been turned upside down on the other tables. Renata Ferrante sat alone in the exact place she'd occupied the previous Friday night, with no lawyers, no one accompanying her, and on the table in front of her lay a thin stack of papers and a phone placed face down. She indicated the chair across from her. Josie sat. There was no greeting. There was no apology. Renata began with a question, and she asked it in the voice of someone reading the first line of a report. She asked who was paying her. Josie said the Ember Room had paid her wages for 3 months, and the week before, no one had paid her anything. Renata said she wasn't asking about wages. She said Josie had refused money from her younger brother on Tuesday, then refused a larger amount from the Halloran family on Thursday afternoon at the bus stop on Windsor Street, and she stated both things as though she were reading 2 entries from the same ledger. Josie asked how she knew. Renata answered that she read everything. Then she asked the next question. Who got you hired here? Josie said she'd applied online to this place and 9 others at the same time, and this was the only one that called her back. Renata asked whether she'd known anyone in the building before that. Josie said no. Renata asked how long she'd been taking orders from the Hallorans. Josie said she'd never even heard that name until Thursday afternoon, when a silver-haired man stepped out of a black car and called her by name. Renata turned a page in front of her. She said that 3 months earlier, a server with the last name Vance had applied to this exact location. 2 weeks earlier, a busboy with the last name Trask had been hired at the same location without going through the approval process. On Friday night, the 2 of them had ended up standing beside each other in the middle of the dining room, while someone at table 9 had raised a phone and started recording from the very first second before anything had even begun. She said she'd worked with numbers for 21 years, and in those 21 years, she'd learned one thing, that when too many things lined up at once, what was happening wasn't coincidence. Josie asked who Renata thought she was. Renata said she thought Josie was someone who had been placed in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, by someone who knew precisely what they were doing. She said she didn't blame her, that everyone had a price, and she only wanted to know what Josie's price was, and who had paid it. Josie listened to all of it. Then she said Renata was wrong. She said she understood why Renata thought that way, because if she looked at everything through numbers the way Renata did, she would probably think exactly the same thing. But the truth was much simpler, and there was no one behind it. Renata placed both hands flat on the table. She asked one final question, and she asked it more slowly than all the others. She asked why someone who had to pay nearly $40,000 in less than a month would turn away the money she desperately needed twice in a row. She said she didn't believe anyone would do that without a reason. Josie sat quietly for a moment. She thought about how she could possibly explain it to a person like this. Then she realized she didn't need to explain, because the answer had been there for a very long time, and it wasn't even hers. She said her grandmother had once worked in a small diner, and there was something she used to say to everyone who sat down at her table, no matter who they were, no matter where they came from, whether they had money or not. Josie repeated the words exactly, in the same calm voice her grandmother had always used. Eat first. Your troubles are your own. Renata Ferrante said nothing. For about 3 seconds, her face showed absolutely no expression. Then the blood drained from it. Josie saw it happen clearly in the weak yellow light of the desk lamp, and she had no idea what she'd just said. Renata shot to her feet, sending the chair scraping backward with a dry sound across the wooden floor. She didn't pick up the papers. She didn't take her phone. She walked straight toward the front door, and Josie saw her hand trembling as she pushed it open. She didn't say a single word. Josie got home close to 1 o'clock in the morning and didn't go to sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with the lights off and replayed the entire conversation in her mind from the first sentence to the last. She had answered every question correctly. She had told the truth in every single answer. And yet the thing that had made that woman spring to her feet and walk away with trembling hands wasn't any answer Josie had given. It was a sentence she'd merely repeated, a sentence that didn't belong to her, a sentence her grandmother had said to hundreds of strangers over 40 years behind a counter. Josie sat there for a long time. Then she stood, walked to the kitchen cabinet, and pulled open the bottom drawer. The envelope was still exactly where she'd left it beneath the old papers. Its edges yellowed, her name written across it in the trembling handwriting of an 81-year-old woman. For 3 years she'd picked it up hundreds of times and put it back hundreds of times, because her grandmother had told her to open it if she ever ran out of road, and because Josie Vance had never been willing to admit that she'd reached the end. Tonight she picked it up and didn't put it down again. She tore open the edge of the envelope. There was no money inside, no check, no savings book, no address for some wealthy relative in another state. There was only a small photograph, printed on paper that had faded with age, its upper left corner creased. Josie switched on the table lamp and looked at it. The picture showed the outside of a roadside diner, with only half the lettering on the sign above it still visible, and 2 people standing beside each other in front of the glass door. The woman on the right was her grandmother, Ada Vance, much younger than in any photograph Josie had ever seen, her hair tied at the nape of her neck, wearing a white apron, one arm draped around the shoulders of the girl beside her. The girl on the left was very young, thin, wearing a diner uniform 1 size too large for her body. Her hair was platinum blonde, cut to her shoulders. She wasn't smiling. She stared directly into the camera with an expression Josie had seen somewhere very recently, and it took her nearly a full minute to remember where. She turned the photograph over. On the back was the year, 1999, and beneath it, a handwritten line from her grandmother, from a time when her handwriting was still steady and beautiful. Rita, the girl has no one. Josie sat down on the kitchen floor with the photograph in her hand. She stayed there until morning. At 9 o'clock the next morning, someone knocked on the door. Nico Ferrante stood alone in the hallway, with no one accompanying him, and he looked like a man who hadn't slept all night. He said he needed to talk and apologized for coming at that hour. Josie invited him inside. Toby had already gone to school. They sat in the 2 chairs at the kitchen table, and Nico placed a file he'd been carrying inside his coat onto the table. He said his sister had called him close to 1 o'clock the night before, something she hadn't done once in 6 years, and she hadn't said anything else. She'd only asked him one question, and then hung up. She'd asked whether he knew the name of Josie Vance's grandmother. He said he'd stayed awake all night looking into it, and by 4 o'clock in the morning he'd found something he'd never known in all 34 years of being that woman's younger brother. He opened the file. Inside were copies of expense records, dozens of pages stretching across 2 decades. He said that beginning in 2003, his sister had regularly spent money on something no one in the family knew about, and she'd paid for it through a private account that appeared in none of the books she managed. He said she'd hired people to find a family, not one person, a family with the last name Vance, who had once lived in a small town in Indiana in the late 1990s. He said she'd searched for 20 years and never found them, because the family had left that town long ago, moved through 3 different cities, and she'd never had a first name to follow. only a surname and a diner that had closed in 2001. Then Nico told her the last part, and he said it very slowly. He said that 3 months earlier, a payroll sheet from the Ember Room had been sent upstairs as it was every month, and on that payroll sheet was a new name, Josie Vance. He said that on that Friday night, his sister hadn't gone there to have dinner. She'd canceled 2 meetings to be there. She'd brought 2 lawyers with her only so she would have a reason to remain seated longer. She had gone to the Ember Room that night for one reason, and one reason only, to see with her own eyes the face of the girl carrying the name Vance. 3 days later, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, before the Ember Room had even opened, and the staff were still polishing glasses on the west side, Renata Ferrante walked in alone. There was no car waiting outside. No one followed half a step behind her. She wore a gray coat worn at the elbows, and her hair fell loose to her shoulders, instead of being pinned up. Dolores froze in the middle of the room with a polishing cloth in her hand. Gus came out of the kitchen and stopped in the doorway. Milo Trask was arranging chairs along the east side, and he lowered the chair in his hands very slowly, as though if he moved gently enough, she might not notice him. Renata asked Gus whether Miss Vance was there. He said she was on her way. Renata nodded and sat down at table 4 to wait, and for those 20 minutes, she asked no one to bring her anything. Didn't take out her phone, only sat looking at her 2 hands resting on the tabletop. Josie arrived at 4:20. She had the photograph in her coat pocket. She sat down across from Renata, and before she could say anything, Renata began. She said she was going to tell her a story, and she asked Josie not to interrupt, because she'd never told it to anyone before and she wasn't sure she could tell it a second time. Then she began. She said that in the autumn of the year she was 13, her father put her into a car at 4 o'clock in the morning, and she wasn't allowed to ask where they were going. She said they left her in a small town in Indiana with fewer than 3,000 people and gave her a name, Rita, no last name. She said she'd lived under that name for 2 years, and there were mornings when she woke and needed several seconds to remember who she really was. She said the only place in that town willing to hire a child with no papers was a roadside diner open from 5 o'clock in the morning until 10 at night. For the first 3 months, she was kept in the back kitchen with her face bent over, a sink full of dishes, both hands submerged in water so hot that her fingers wrinkled and wouldn't straighten properly by evening. Later, they let her wait tables. She said she remembered everything. She remembered the smell of coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long. She remembered the way people tapped their fingers against the table when she was slow getting to them. She remembered a man shouting in her face in front of the entire diner because she'd poured his coffee more slowly than he wanted, and she remembered that she was 14 years old, standing there staring at the floor and counting the tiles until he was finished. She said that night she'd made herself one promise. She promised that if she ever made it back to her real name, she would never, not even once, become the kind of person who stood on the other side of a table and spoke to a server in that voice. Then Renata fell silent for a long time. She said there had been a woman behind the counter at that diner. The woman gave her a place to sleep in the little room behind the kitchen, saved a hot meal for her every night, and for 2 full years never asked where she came from, never asked why a 13-year-old child was working alone, never asked whether Rita was her real name. Renata said that every time she sat down wearing the expression of someone preparing to explain herself, the woman only pushed a plate of food toward her and said the same thing. Eat first. Your troubles are your own. Josie took the photograph from her coat pocket and placed it on the table. Renata looked at it and didn't touch it. She said she'd spent 20 years searching for that family so she could repay a debt no one had ever asked her to repay, and she'd never found them. Then 3 months earlier, she saw that last name on a payroll sheet. She said that Friday night, she'd come there to see Josie's face. And then she saved the hardest part for last, saying that when the busboy brushed the back of her chair, she saw an opportunity, and she used it to test whether the girl carrying the Vance name was anything like her grandmother. She said it had been a cowardly thing to do, that she'd used a 19-year-old boy as a tool in a test no one had asked for, and that Josie had passed that test while she had failed it. Then Renata Ferrante stood and walked toward the east side of the room, where Milo stood motionless beside the chair. She told him she was sorry. She said his father had nothing to do with him, that she'd used that history to get what she wanted, and that he didn't owe anyone an explanation. She had to stop twice in the middle of saying it. Her voice wasn't steady either time. Then she turned to Gus and said he'd been right. 15 years was long enough, and she was the one who'd been wrong. Finally, she returned to table 4, looked at Josie, and offered her third apology. It wasn't an apology prepared in advance to preserve appearances. It was awkward, broken, and not a single word of it sounded polished. The following Monday morning, Renata Ferrante went to the family law office and sat there for 6 straight hours. She didn't call any of the people she'd told her younger brother she knew how to reach. She reread every page in the 20-year-old file, circled the 3 pages bearing her own signature, and signed the agreement transferring the 3 southern parcels to the Hallorans, openly, with notarization and every tax paid in full. That afternoon, when Nico arrived, everything was already finished. He looked at the documents, then at his sister, and asked why she'd changed her mind. Renata said she'd spent 26 years doing everything the way their father would have done it, and she'd just realized that not once had he ever asked her how she'd survived those 2 years. She said she didn't want to solve anything his way anymore. The next day, she came to the Ember Room at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and handed Josie an envelope. There was no money inside. It was the charter establishing a fund, already registered and already in effect, covering all medical expenses and tuition costs for employees and their immediate family members at every business owned by the family, regardless of position, regardless of seniority, without requiring anyone to beg anyone for help. Nico matched the entire initial endowment with his own money. The name of the fund appeared on the first line, bold and in capital letters, the Ada Vance Fund. Josie turned to the second page, where the first approved applications were listed in order of submission date, and she read the first line, then had to read it again. At the top of the list wasn't her younger brother's name. It was Milo Trask's mother, whose application had been submitted 9 days earlier, covering the full course of treatment for the arthritis she'd postponed for 2 years because she couldn't afford it. The second name belonged to Dolores's granddaughter. The third was a kitchen worker at another location Josie had never met. Toby Vance was fourth. Renata said the list was ordered by application date and would always remain that way, that no one would be moved ahead because of who they knew, and that if Josie wanted her brother's name placed first, she couldn't do it. That sentence was what made Josie accept the envelope, because if Renata had done it any other way, Josie would have handed it back again. One morning near the end of April, in the apartment on Windsor Street, Toby Vance sat at the kitchen table and put on a pair of headphones. Josie sat across from him, and she'd chosen that song 3 years earlier, the one their mother used to play on Sunday mornings while she cooked. Josie pressed the button. There were a few seconds of silence while the 9-year-old boy sat perfectly still, his head tilted slightly, as though listening to something coming from very far away. Then Toby turned toward his sister, and he smiled. He lifted both hands and made the sign he'd taught her through so many nights on the living room floor, and this time she got it right on the very first try. Patience. The two of them sat there and listened to the entire song together, at the same time, for the first time. 7 months later, on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 people were having lunch at table 4 in the Ember Room. One of them was Renata Ferrante. The other was Milo Trask, now 20 years old, and in the 4th month of the management training program the company had opened to internal employees, and he was explaining the new reservation system to her, with the excited voice of a young man who had just figured something out. Renata listened very carefully. Josie Vance walked past holding the shift log, because she'd returned 5 months earlier as the evening shift manager. And as she passed, Renata reached out and lightly touched her hand for only a moment, without saying anything. Near the entrance, Nico Ferrante stood waiting with both hands in the pockets of his coat. He didn't come inside. He only looked at her and said nothing, and Josie smiled at him before turning back to her shift log. The most powerful thing Josie Vance did in this story wasn't bringing down a woman an entire city feared. She only reminded that woman who she had once been, on the night when she had nearly forgotten completely. Because a person's dignity isn't found in the uniform they're wearing, isn't determined by the table where they sit or the tray they carry, and no one in this world is small enough to deserve being spoken about in that voice. We all have days when we walk out the door with barely enough strength left inside us to keep our backs straight, and one kind word from a stranger can be the thing that keeps us standing until the end of that day. Sometimes the bravest act of kindness isn't doing something enormous for someone. Sometimes it's telling a person the truth before they have the chance to lose the last good part of themselves. If Josie's story touched you today, please like and share this video with someone you think needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening together to new meaningful stories every day. And we'd truly love to hear what you think. What are your thoughts about what Josie did? And if you believe every human being deserves respect, no matter what kind of work they do, leave a comment with the words, "Dignity has no uniform." May you and your family always have abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.